Last year, we deliberately burned just under 5 million hectares of forest here in Western Australia. That's Kings Park, 12,230 times over. The rationale for burning down this incredible amount of forest was to reduce forest flammability and therefore to reduce risk to human lives, assets, and biodiversity. We call this policy prescribe burning. My name is Carolyn Orr, and I'm a medical specialist. And prescribe burning sounds very medical, doesn't it? I prescribe medications and recommend procedures and surgeries to try and help sick people get better. But before doctors like me recommend anything, we have to think our way through 4 key principles first of all. Will it be effective? What are the side effects? What's the cost? Are there better alternatives? These are pretty good things to think about in a lot of areas in life, by the way, not just medicine. The process of thinking through these things is called evidence-based medicine. It's the science behind the art of what I do, and it is conventional medicine's superpower. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how evidence-based medicine works in my own field of neurology, and then we'll apply that framework to prescribe burning as it happens here in Western Australia. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist called Egas Moniz was working on a surgical procedure to try and help people with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, in obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, people have anxious thoughts and fears about harms and contamination. So they repetitively wash their hands, they check that windows and doors are locked, and they check that they've turned off the stove and the oven. When it's severe, OCD can actually be profoundly disabling. Now, back in the 1930s, our concepts of OCD were actually quite simplistic. We thought that these anxious thoughts and fears came from the front part of the brain and then endlessly circulated around different brain regions, perpetuating these behaviours. And Dr. Minut's idea was that if you could disconnect the front part of the brain from the rest of it, you could help these people. Now, when they started rolling out the operation, they noticed an immediate dramatic improvement overnight. Previously completely disabled by obsessive-compulsive behaviours, these just stopped, and patients seemed to have peace for the first time. Now, this made a profound impression on the treating doctors. You've got to remember that this was back at the time when we didn't have any effective drug therapies at all for mental illness. It seemed like a simple solution to a complex problem. The operation was then exported to be done on many people throughout the world, including people who had illnesses other than obsessive-compulsive disorder. And in 1949, Dr. Egas Moniz received the Nobel Prize for services to medicine, for his role in developing the operation that we know of as the frontal lobotomy. Now, note, all of this happened without any proof of long-term effectiveness of that operation. And in medicine, what we know is that it doesn't matter how dramatic or compelling an anecdote is. You've got to have good long-term evidence to back it up. Now, medicine, fortunately, does self-correct over time. And what psychiatrists found, is that patients who had the operation, sure, they weren't performing their obsessive-compulsive behaviours anymore, but the truth was they weren't doing much of anything at all. They were passive and apathetic. Our frontal lobes are the seat of personality, judgment, and behaviour. What frontal lobotomy was doing, it wasn't curing any kind of mental illness, it was actually turning a human being into something akin to a human cattle. The ineffectiveness of lobotomy was realised, the operation quietly fell out of favour, and in 2023, Dr. Minut's is no longer recognised as a medical hero. In Western Australia, our target for prescribed burning is to keep 45% of the landscape with a fuel age of 6 years or less. Here in the southwest corner, we're target burning 200,000 hectares per annum. But how effective is prescribed burning? Does it reduce forest flammability? Where'd they get those numbers from anyway? Now, it turns out that if you burn a forest down, you do reduce forest flammability temporarily for around 3 to 6 years. But then what happens is as the forest regrows back, that dense regrowth makes forest more flammable than it was in the first place. That's where the 6-year interval comes from. That's why they burn again. But modern fire science tells us that if you can manage to leave a forest for long enough, say about 20 years, and don't burn it and don't log it in that time, what happens is the forests grow back, mature forests become much less flammable than younger forests. Not only that, they're less flammable than recently burned forests. What that means is that if we want to reduce forest flammability, the best thing to do is leave them alone, and that by prescribed burning in a regular cycle, we're actually increasing fire risk, not reducing it. We've been looking on far too short a time frame, just like Dr. Minitz. So much for the 6-year interval. Well, what about 200,000 hectares per annum? Well, would you believe that comes from 1994, when what they did was they averaged the burning they were doing at that stage with what they were doing in the 1950s, and they said, we'll burn 200,000 hectares per annum. It's a back-of-the-envelope calculation that got turned into a target that then got locked in stone and in law. We're burning 200,000 hectares per annum based on no good scientific evidence whatsoever for that target. And to do so, we're burning lots of remote forest far away from people in towns. Please tell me exactly how this protects lives or assets. Now, we do have modern evidence for prescribed burning from the 2019-2020 bushfires in the eastern states that were so dramatic. They did extensive prescribed burning beforehand. And what they found was that the prescribed burning that they did reduced bushfire severity a little, about half the time, only in areas that they'd very recently burned. It didn't make any difference anywhere else at all. That is completely underwhelming, and it's entirely consistent with what they noted after the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. So what that means is that here in Western Australia, we have a policy that's based on a discredited theory of ever-increasing forest flammability that we know isn't true, somebody's guesstimate from 1994, and it doesn't fit with the best available fire science we currently have. So I'm giving this one a fail for effectiveness. Now, honestly, if it was a drug, I would stop right here. But for the purpose of the exercise, we're going to continue. So let's think about side effects. Now, in medicine, side effects, of course, are trade-offs. Adverse effects that a patient might be willing to tolerate if the drug or procedure is effective. In the late 1950s, a German drug called Comtergan was marketed as a cure for insomnia and for morning sickness. It was said to be very effective, and actually it was. It was a terrific drug for nausea and for insomnia, and many, many thousands of people took this. Now, shortly after this, doctors noticed an absolute epidemic of babies being born with profound deformities. Missing eyes, missing arms and legs, malformed hearts. The strange thing about this was just how geographically localized these epidemics were. We had cases in West, but not East Germany. Canada was affected, Britain, Australia, but there were no cases at all in the USA. Now, it turned out that the cause was Comtergan, which you've probably heard of using its scientific name of thalidomide. Now, thalidomide is deadly toxic to sensory nerves, and the developing fetus needs an intact sensory nervous system to form organs. There was no problem with the effectiveness of thalidomide. It's actually a terrific drug for nausea and for insomnia, but it wasn't properly screened for side effects before mass marketing, and those side effects played out in the life of 10,000 human beings, half of whom died from their deformities. The other half had to live their lives with profound disability. What are the side effects of prescribed burning? The side effects of prescribed burning play out in human health, in animal welfare, and in climate change. Wood smoke is about the most toxic kind of air pollution that the average human being will ever breathe. It contains nasty toxic particles called PM2.5, carbon monoxide, respiratory irritants, and carcinogens. That's agents that cause cancer. We know that it's toxic to the heart, the lungs, the brain, and blood vessels. And humans exposed to wood smoke have an increased risk of death, heart attacks, stroke, pneumonia, asthma attacks, and birth complications. We know that if humans are exposed to a bushfire, there's a dramatic increase in hospital admissions up to hundreds of kilometres away that lasts for days at a time. Now, wood smoke is toxic to human beings, and that doesn't matter whether you're breathing it in from a prescribed burn, or from a bushfire, or even from a traditional wooden fireplace. In fact, there's reasons to be concerned that wood smoke from prescribed burns are more dangerous to human beings than from natural bushfires because they're done so much more often. They're often done closer to homes, and they're done when conditions are fair, and that means that smoke lingers. Now, what's really clear is that humans should be exposed to the absolute minimum amount of smoke that's possible. We need to adopt a least smoke policy. A much neglected side effect of prescribed burns is the death and suffering of animals, either killed directly from smoke or from fire, or who die afterwards from starvation or becoming easy prey to predators. And then there's climate change. A mature tree is an absolutely terrific store of carbon. And when you burn that tree down, you've immediately released that carbon to the environment, where it contributes to global heating. Now, as trees grow back, they start to take up carbon again, but it takes many, many, many decades for that tree to become as efficient a store of carbon as the mature tree was in the first place. We're in the 2020s. This is the decade that's going to determine the outcome of the climate emergency, and emergency it most assuredly is. Deforestation is a key accelerant of the climate crisis, and that's just as important here in Western Australia as it is in places like the Amazon. Trees are our only naturally occurring weapon against climate change, and at this time, more than at any other time in human history, we need our mature forests standing intact. Now let's talk about costs. In 2021, a drug called Zolgensma was given the tick by the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme so that doctors could prescribe it. And this was remarkable because Zolgensma is the most expensive drug in human history. One single dose of Zolgensma costs a cool $3 million. You'd be a bit nervous being the nurse looking after that vial, wouldn't you? Zolgensma is used to treat a really dreadful neurological condition called spinal muscular atrophy. Now, in spinal muscular atrophy, a baby is born normal, but then develops profound motor disability over the next few years and decades, evolving to become completely wheelchair-bound, unable to move, having difficulty speaking, swallowing, and ultimately breathing. And their lives are usually measured in a few decades. The disease is ultimately lethal after causing them a lifetime of disability. It's a truly horrible disease. Now, one single dose of Zolgensma, given at diagnosis in infancy before the baby has accumulated any disability, is effectively curative for this condition. That's why we're prepared to pay $3 million for one dose of Zolgensma. Now, this is fantastic, but of course, the minute it went on the PBS, there was a push for everyone in Australia affected by spinal muscular atrophy to have immediate access to the drug. Now, the problem here is that if you're 30 years of age and completely fully disabled by the condition, it's going to do nothing for you because it doesn't reverse fixed disability. But what if you're 15 and severely disabled but still have a bit to go? What if you're 10? What if you're 5? Where do we draw the line for this incredibly expensive drug? Now, I'm an adult neurologist, so thank heavens I'm not personally having to make that decision, but that's an example of the kind of cost considerations we have in medicine. What cost issues come when it comes to prescribed burning? Now, we've already mentioned that the price tag of prescribed burning here in Western Australia comes to an absolute minimum of $50 million per annum. That would buy you a hell of a lot of Zolgensma. But that's just the direct costs. You've got to tack onto that the indirect costs. So think about the healthcare costs of treating the illnesses that are caused by prescribed burning. Now, a study from New South Wales estimated that prescribed burning costs us roughly $18 million a year in Australia each year for the illnesses that are caused by prescribed burning, so whatever Western Australia's share of that is. Then tack onto that cost to agriculture. Prescribed burning is very frequently done in spring, and that's when trees and plants flower. Smoke and heat shuts that process off, and that impacts bees and pollination, and a lot of industries depend on pollination. So obviously honey, but also almonds, also avocados, berries, and wine. So there's an impact on agriculture. There's also an impact on recreation and tourism, because no one wants to go on holiday when there's a prescribed burn right next to you. You can't breathe because of smoke, and visibility is non-existent. But even more significant than financial costs are the biological costs of prescribed burning. One of the stated aims of prescribed burning is to protect biodiversity as well as lives and assets. But we're burning on a 6-year cycle, and what we know is that many, many plants and trees require significantly more than 6 years to recover. Some require a decade, some require many, many decades, and this is the same for animal populations. And what that means is that by burning on such a regular basis, we're causing the slow, steady, sure extinction of Western Australia's native biodiversity, and that's absolutely irreplaceable. Now, to add insult to injury, a lot of the burning is being done in spring, which is the worst possible time because that's when things are flowering and birds are nesting. And also what's happening is that progressively over time, prescribed burning is making our forests younger and younger and younger, and very old trees are absolutely critically important for animal conservation. And this actually leads to another cost, which is actually, would you believe, to medicine. Now, many of the drugs that doctors use most commonly, like penicillin, which we know comes from fungus, or aspirin, which comes from the willow tree, are derived from the natural world. Even today, a new drug that goes onto the market is far more likely to be something that we've sort of filched from the natural world rather than what some boffin in a lab coat has cooked up chemically. But did you know that despite all of that, we've only screened less than 0.5% of all the plants in the world for their medicinal potential? So when I'm in my clinic and I diagnose yet another patient with one of the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's that I specialise in, I have to think to myself, what possible cures for this person's illness are we currently sending up in smoke as we target burn Western Australia's forests? Finally, let's think about alternatives. A few years ago, I was asked to review a paper on a condition called hemifacial spasm. Now, in hemifacial spasm, the facial nerve that controls the muscles of the face is irritable and it jumps. And what that means is that the person winks involuntarily. It's a bit annoying for the person and it can be socially embarrassing, but it's not really particularly serious and it's not life-threatening in any way. The cause of it's quite common, you might well know someone that's got this. Hemifacial spasm is caused by the nerve being a little bit close to a blood vessel. And what actually happens is that the pulsations of the blood vessel irritate the nerve and so it jumps and so does the face. Neurosurgeons had a treatment for this. What they were doing was they were going in and doing a brain operation to separate the nerve and the blood vessel and put a bit of Teflon between the two. And that was brilliant. It cured the procedure. Cured the condition. Sounds great, doesn't it? Just one problem. After the operation, 1 person in 100 developed a permanent facial droop. 1 person in 50 became deaf on that side, and there were even a few deaths. That's a hell of an impact for a condition that, let's face it, is basically an inconvenience. Now, we already had a very good therapy for hemifacial spasm, which is that neurologists like me could put a bit of Botox in the face. Now, that didn't do anything at all to the nerve, but it calmed down the muscles and effectively cured the symptoms. Sure, we had to repeat. Botox only lasts about 3 months, but you can repeat as often as you need to, and we can't cause any permanent damage because even if you go overboard on it, the face will recover after a few weeks. So it's a really safe treatment for a condition that, let's face it, is fairly minor. I rejected that paper. What are the alternatives when it comes to prescribed burning? Well, there's quite a lot, actually. Rapid detection and suppression of fires, arson prevention, not building houses right out in the sticks when they're going to be at high risk, and also architectural design of houses to make them as fireproof as possible. And then mechanical thinning. So, for example, in areas around towns where you really do need to clear trees and vegetation, rather than going and burning them and exposing the human population to wood smoke that we know is horribly toxic. If you can mechanically clear the trees and vegetation, you've avoided that risk. And then in areas where you really do need to burn, there is a group of experts in Western Australia who've been successfully, sustainably managing our forests for something around 60,000 years. The traditional custodians of this land burn smaller, more selectively, and a hell of a lot smarter than we do. And I think it's time we give them the respect and hearing that they deserve. Because if we can marry traditional ecological knowledge with the best available fire science, we might be in a position to craft a fire policy that's worthy of the 21st century. I've been in medicine for 33 years, and in that time, I've seen amazing advances in our ability to prevent, treat, and diagnose disease. Scrutinising everything we do with an evidence-based lens is a lot of the reason why we've come so far. We know that simple solutions aren't always the right ones, and we're not afraid to change direction when the evidence supports that we do so. Our fire management policy in this state aims to protect human lives, assets, and biodiversity. To do this, we're burning enormous amounts of forest to reach unscientific targets that don't have a good evidence base. And in the process, we're making the landscape more fire prone. Evidence tells us that target-driven prescribed burning is not effective to reduce risk to life and assets. Its side effects include harm to human health. Its cost is the irreversible loss of our biodiversity, and alternatives do exist. I'm speaking today on behalf of Doctors for the Environment Australia, and I'd like to add our voice to the many at this conference calling for an urgent and independent review into the policy and practice of prescribed burning here in Western Australia.